18 years ago, a pastor made a life-changing decision. He adopted 5 black boys, giving them the love and home they never had. Now they've all grown up and moved on, until suddenly, out of nowhere, they all return. But they're not just back to celebrate his retirement. They've been planning something for years, something so big that when they finally reveal it, the pastor is left in tears. But here's the shocking part. He refuses to accept it. Why? What secret is holding him back? And will his sons be able to convince him to take what he truly deserves? This is a story of love, sacrifice, and a gift that changes everything. Forever. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The Alabama sunset painted Pastor Samuel Hayes' modest living room in hues of amber and gold, the light catching dust motes that danced like memories in the air. The worn leather of his favorite armchair creaked as he shifted, his weathered hands resting on the open Bible in his lap. The familiar verses blurred before his eyes as his mind wandered to the empty spaces around him, spaces that once echoed with the laughter and footsteps of 5 energetic boys, now grown and scattered across the country like dandelion seeds in the wind. At 70, Samuel's face carried the gentle lines of a life spent in service to others, each crease a testament to countless prayers and comforting words offered to his congregation. His silver hair caught the fading sunlight as he reached for his coffee cup, the steam rising in lazy spirals. The house felt especially quiet tonight, the kind of quiet that made memories sound louder than reality, that made the tick of the old grandfather clock in the hallway feel like thunderclaps. The sharp ring of the telephone cut through his reverie, making him start. He glanced at the clock. 7:15 p.m. His heart did a little jump as he recognized the number on the caller ID. Marcus, his eldest, his steady one. Hello? Samuel's voice was warm but careful, like someone handling delicate china. Dad. Marcus's familiar voice came through, carrying an unusual weight that made Samuel sit up straighter. How are you? I'm doing just fine, son. Just having my evening coffee and reading. The familiar ritual suddenly felt important to mention, as if to reassure them both that some things remained constant. There was a pause, and Samuel could hear Marcus taking a deep breath, the kind that usually preceded important news. Dad, I need to tell you something. The formal tone in his son's voice sent a flutter of concern through Samuel's chest. What is it, Marcus? We're all coming home, Dad, all 5 of us, for your retirement celebration. Samuel's hand tightened around the phone, his knuckles whitening. All 5 of you? Yes, sir. It's been too long since we were all together, and with you retiring from the church. Marcus's voice softened. We want to be there. Samuel forced his voice to remain steady, though his heart was racing like a young man's. That's wonderful news, son. He tried to sound cheerful, but something in his chest tightened. When? In 2 weeks. We've all arranged to take time off. Samuel's eyes drifted to the dining table, where 5 chairs sat empty around its scratched surface, each mark and dent telling its own story. How many meals had they shared there? How many prayers? How many conversations that shaped the men his boys had become? How many times had he sat alone there recently, eating simple meals while reading his morning devotionals? Of course, he said, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't quite name. You know you're always welcome home. After they discussed the details and said their goodbyes, Samuel placed the phone down with trembling fingers. The silence felt heavier now, pregnant with possibilities and… what was it? Fear? Hope? Both? The weight of unspoken words seemed to fill the room. He stood slowly, his joints protesting as he walked to the wall where the family photo hung, its frame slightly tilted as it always was, no matter how many times he straightened it. It was taken 15 years ago when the boys were still teenagers, their faces bright with youth and promise. His fingers traced each face, Marcus, the protective older brother, always standing tall and serious, shoulders squared as if already carrying the weight of responsibility. The others, each with their own special place in his heart, each smile holding memories that made his chest ache with love and longing. The glass was slightly dusty under his touch, a testament to how long he'd avoided looking too closely at it. When was the last time they'd all been together? 4 years? 5? Letters, phone calls, and occasional visits from 1 or 2 at a time had become the norm, like pieces of a puzzle that never quite came together. But all 5? Something stirred in his gut, a father's intuition perhaps, or maybe just the natural worry of a parent who knows his children too well. That night, kneeling beside his bed as he had done every night for the past 40 years, Samuel's prayer was different. "Lord," he whispered into the darkness, his voice barely disturbing the quiet. "Give me wisdom. Give me strength." His knees ached against the hard floor, but he stayed there, letting his worries flow into his prayers like water into thirsty ground. Help me be the father they need, even now. The moonlight filtered through his window, casting long shadows across the floor, painting silver patterns that reminded him of his son's childhood nightlights. In 2 weeks, these quiet rooms would be filled again with voices and footsteps and life. But as joy fought with apprehension in his heart, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this reunion than a simple retirement celebration. Something in Marcus's voice, something in the timing of it all, whispered of changes to come. The cricket's symphony filtered through the screened windows of Samuel's modest home, a familiar southern lullaby that usually brought him comfort. Tonight, though, his mind wouldn't settle, too full of memories and questions that had been stirring since he'd received word of his son's impending visit. His feet carried him across the worn carpet to his bedroom, where an old wooden chest sat in the corner, its dark oak surface dulled by decades of use and loving touches. Samuel's knees creaked as he knelt before it, his fingers tracing the brass latch that had grown loose over the years. The lid opened with a gentle groan, releasing the subtle scent of cedar and memories that wrapped around him like an old friend's embrace. Inside, carefully preserved in manila envelopes and photo albums, lay the precious fragments of his journey as a father, moments captured in time that told the story of their unlikely family. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted out the first stack of photographs, each one carefully protected in clear plastic sleeves. There was Marcus, no more than 12, standing proudly beside him at the church podium, trying to mimic his father's pastoral stance. His oldest son had already been so serious, so determined to shoulder responsibility beyond his years. Samuel's throat tightened at the memory of how Marcus had always wanted to help, even when the hymnals were almost too heavy for his small arms to carry. The next photo showed Devin in his first football uniform, grass-stained and grinning despite the team's loss, his resilient spirit shining through even then. Samuel remembered how he'd struggled to convince Devin that winning wasn't everything, that showing up and giving your best was what truly mattered. That conversation had lasted well into the night, with Devin finally understanding when Samuel shared stories of his own failures and victories. His heart swelled at the image of Jamal in his graduation gown, valedictorian cord draped around his neck, standing tall despite the odds that had been stacked against him. The quiet determination in his son's eyes reminded Samuel of all the late nights he'd found Jamal studying by flashlight, unwilling to let his circumstances define his future. He'd bought Jamal a proper desk lamp the very next day, stretching his budget even thinner. A candid shot of Eric and Andre wrestling on the front porch brought both a smile and a pang to his chest. They were so young then, their laughter echoing through the years captured in the faded photograph. Eric had just lost his first tooth and Andre's curls were wild and untamed. He could almost hear their playful shouts, see the worry in his own eyes as he'd watched from the doorway, always afraid they'd hurt themselves, but knowing they needed the freedom to be children. At the bottom of the stack, protected in a simple silver frame that had been a gift from the church ladies, was the photograph that changed everything. The day they became a family on paper, though they'd been one in heart for months before. 5 pairs of eyes looked back at him, each holding a different shade of uncertainty and hope. Marcus, trying to look brave for his brothers, his arm protective around Devin's shoulders. Devin, suspicious of another broken promise but standing straight and tall. Jamal, calculating their odds of staying, his keen mind already working through possibilities. Eric, half hidden behind Marcus, peeking out with cautious curiosity. and little Andre clutching Samuel's hand like a lifeline, his other thumb tucked secretly in his mouth. Samuel sank onto his bed, the frame heavy in his hands. "Did I give them enough?" he whispered to the empty room, his voice thick with emotion. "Did they know how much I loved them, even when I couldn't give them everything they wanted, even when I had to say no to new shoes or birthday parties?" The memories flooded back. The nights he'd gone hungry to ensure they had enough to eat, the extra shifts he'd picked up to buy school supplies, the endless prayers for wisdom to guide these 5 precious souls entrusted to his care. Every sacrifice had been worth it, but still, the doubt crept in like an old familiar shadow. He placed the frame on the bed and lowered himself to his knees beside it, feeling every one of his years in his joints. The familiar position brought comfort as he bowed his head, silver-streaked hair catching the lamplight. "Lord," he prayed, his voice barely above a whisper, "did I fulfill the calling you gave me? Did I show them your love the way they needed to see it? Was I enough?" The old clock in the hallway ticked steadily, marking time as Samuel remained in prayer, his heart heavy with questions that only his returning sons could answer. Through the window, the crickets continued their evening song, a reminder of God's constant presence in the quiet moments. Finally, he gathered the photographs and carefully returned them to the chest, each one a treasure to be preserved. But he kept one out, the picture of all 5 boys together, their young faces full of possibility and promise. He placed it on his nightstand, a reminder of the blessing he'd been given and the responsibility he'd carried through all these years. "Lord, bring them home safe," he whispered, reaching for the lamp. The room fell into darkness, but the image of his sons remained clear in his mind, as vivid as the day it was taken, each face etched permanently in his heart. The morning sun painted Samuel's front porch in warm stripes of light, but his heart felt anything but settled. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the empty driveway with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. The familiar crunch of tires on gravel made his breath catch. A sleek black SUV appeared around the bend, and Samuel's fingers tightened their grip on each other, his knuckles turning white with tension. Marcus emerged first, his tall frame unfolding from the driver's seat. The years had filled out his shoulders, and his confident stride reminded Samuel of how much his eldest had grown. There was a new maturity in the way he carried himself, a quiet authority that spoke of his success. But there was something in Marcus's eyes, a flicker of something unspoken, a weight of responsibility that made Samuel's chest tighten. "Dad," Marcus said softly, wrapping his arms around Samuel in a firm embrace. The hug felt different somehow, more careful, more measured, as if Marcus was holding back something more than just affection. Before Samuel could dwell on it, another car pulled up, then another. The quiet morning erupted into a symphony of car doors slamming and excited voices calling out, breaking the peaceful stillness of the neighborhood. Devin bounded up the steps, his energy filling the space like electricity. "Pop!" he shouted, pulling Samuel into a bear hug that lifted him slightly off his feet. His second eldest had always worn his heart on his sleeve, but today there was an edge to his enthusiasm that felt forced, like he was trying too hard to maintain his usual exuberance. Jamal approached next, his steps measured and thoughtful, each movement deliberate. His hug was gentle, and his dark eyes studied Samuel's face carefully, searching for something. "Looking good, Dad," he said softly, but his gaze held questions he wasn't asking, concerns he was keeping hidden. Eric moved in quietly like he always did, offering a warm but reserved embrace. His silence spoke volumes, different from his usual comfortable quiet. There was tension in his shoulders that Samuel had never felt before. Andre, the baby of the family, practically ran up the steps. "Dad," he called out, his face breaking into that familiar bright smile that could light up a room. He hugged Samuel tightly, pressing his face into his father's shoulder like he used to do as a child, and for a moment it felt like nothing had changed. But when he pulled back, there was a nervousness in his expression that Samuel had never seen before, a flutter of uncertainty in his usually confident demeanor. The house came alive with their presence, deep voices echoing off the walls, footsteps thundering up and down the stairs, suitcases being dragged across wooden floors. The sounds Samuel had missed for so long filled every corner of his modest home, bringing both comfort and an inexplicable anxiety. In the living room, Devon was already telling stories, his hands moving animatedly as he spoke, his voice carrying that familiar, passionate tone. Eric and Jamal sat on the couch, adding details here and there, while Andre perched on the armrest, laughing at all the right moments, though his eyes kept darting to his older brothers. Marcus stood by the window, his phone in his hand but his attention clearly on his brothers, watching them with an intensity that seemed out of place. Samuel watched from the kitchen doorway, his fingers gripping the counter's edge until his hands ached. On the surface, everything looked perfect. His boys were home, they were laughing, sharing stories. But something felt off, like a familiar song played slightly out of tune. He noticed the way Marcus kept glancing at his brothers with meaningful looks, those silent communications that had always existed between them, now seeming more frequent and weighted. How Jamal seemed to be studying everyone's reactions more than participating in the conversation, his analytical mind clearly at work. The way Eric's smile didn't quite reach his eyes, stopping short of the genuine warmth Samuel knew so well. Even Devon's boisterous laughter had a forced quality to it, like he was trying to fill the spaces between words with noise. And Andre, sweet Andre, kept looking at his older brothers as if waiting for some kind of signal, his usual eagerness to please tinged with uncertainty. Samuel's grip tightened on the counter as he watched them, his knuckles white against the dark surface. The joy of having them home was real, but so was the undercurrent of something else, something they weren't telling him. His sons were here, but they had brought a shadow with them, and it hung over their reunion like a storm cloud waiting to break, heavy with unspoken words and hidden purpose. The aroma of fried chicken and cornbread filled Samuel's modest dining room as 6 plates circled the well-worn wooden table. Samuel watched his sons settle into their childhood seats, a sight that made his heart swell and ache all at once. The ceiling fan whirred softly overhead, casting gentle shadows across their faces. Sunlight filtered through the faded curtains, dancing across the scratches and stains that marked years of family meals. "Pass the cornbread, will you?" Devon reached across the table, his voice carrying that familiar, eager tone. "Nobody makes it like you do, Pop." Samuel managed a small smile, sliding the basket toward his son. "Your grandmother's recipe," he said softly. "Never changed a thing." His fingers lingered on the basket's worn edges, remembering how his mother's hands had once done the same. Andre piled his plate high with collard greens just like he used to as a boy. "Remember when I used to hide these under my napkin?" He chuckled, taking a big bite. "Now I can't get enough of them." The fork trembled slightly in his hand, betraying his nervousness despite his light tone. "That's because Dad would catch you every single time," Marcus added, pouring himself some sweet tea. He didn't even have to look up from his plate. The ice cubes clinked against the glass, a sound that echoed through Samuel's memories of countless summer dinners. The brothers erupted in laughter, and Samuel found himself studying their faces. They were men now, but he could still see traces of those 5 scared boys who'd first walked through his door all those years ago. The worry lines around their eyes, the confident set of their shoulders, all testified to the years that had passed. "Hey, Andre," Devon grinned mischievously, his eyes sparkling with remembered mischief. "Remember how you used to sneak into Dad's room whenever there was a thunderstorm?" Andre's cheeks reddened slightly. "I wasn't scared," he protested, fidgeting with his napkin. "I was just making sure Dad was okay." "Sure you were," Devon teased, reaching over to ruffle his younger brother's hair. "That's why you'd be shaking like a leaf under his covers." More laughter filled the room, but Jamal's attention was fixed on Samuel. He noticed how his father's fork moved more than it lifted food to his mouth, how his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Across the table, Marcus caught Jamal's gaze, and something unspoken passed between them. The weight of their shared concern hung heavy in the air. "The time Andre tried to convince us all there was a ghost in the attic," Eric chimed in, his usually quiet voice animated with the memory. "And Dad had to march us all up there with flashlights to prove it was just the old water heater making noise." His words carried the warmth of cherished memories. "Y'all never let me live anything down." Andre shook his head, but his smile was warm. He glanced at Samuel, seeking that familiar look of affectionate understanding. Samuel sat back in his chair, watching his sons share stories and memories. It should have felt perfect, his family together again, sharing meals and memories like they used to. But something felt off, like a familiar song played in the wrong key. The laughter seemed to hover above them rather than settle comfortably around them. The old chair creaked beneath him, a sound that seemed to underscore his discomfort. The conversation dipped into a momentary lull, and in that brief silence, Samuel felt the weight of whatever was unsaid press down on them all. His eyes met Marcus's, and his eldest son quickly looked down at his plate, confirming Samuel's growing unease. The ticking of the kitchen clock seemed suddenly loud in the quiet. The silence stretched for just a heartbeat too long before Devon launched into another story, his voice a little too loud, his enthusiasm a little too forced. But Samuel barely heard the words. His mind was stuck on that look in Marcus's eyes, that careful way his sons seemed to be moving around something unspoken. The food on his plate grew cold as his appetite waned with his mounting concern. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow on Samuel's weathered hands as he measured coffee grounds into the filter. The familiar routine brought comfort on this momentous day. The old coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the quiet house with its gentle brewing sounds, a rhythm that had marked countless mornings in this home. Samuel leaned against the counter, his Sunday suit already pressed and waiting upstairs. Memories of countless Sunday mornings flooded back, rushing 5 young boys through breakfast, fixing crooked ties, and searching for missing dress shoes. Now those boys were men, sleeping soundly in their childhood bedrooms, their soft breathing echoing through the halls just like when they were little. Heavy footsteps creaked overhead, followed by the sound of running water. His sons were stirring. Samuel poured himself a cup of coffee, adding just a splash of cream like always, watching the white swirl into dark. The kitchen slowly came alive as his boys filed in one by one, each dressed sharply in suits and ties, their shoes clicking against the tile floor. "Morning, Pop," Andre said softly, giving his father a quick side hug before reaching for a coffee mug. His youngest had grown so tall, but his gentle spirit remained unchanged, still seeking approval in those warm eyes. Marcus appeared last, his tie perfectly knotted and his shoes gleaming. But there was tension in his shoulders, and his usual confident smile seemed forced, betraying the weight of whatever was on his mind. "Everyone ready?" he asked, checking his watch. "We should head out soon." The drive to church was quiet, punctuated only by casual comments about the weather and traffic. Samuel sat in the passenger seat while Marcus drove, stealing glances at his eldest son's troubled expression. The other brothers filled the back seats, their usual banter subdued, the air heavy with unspoken words. The church parking lot was already full when they arrived, cars spilling onto the grass. Samuel's heart swelled at the sight of so many familiar faces filing into the building where he'd spent the last 30 years preaching. Church members greeted him with warm hugs and tearful smiles, each touch a reminder of shared moments and sacred trust. Inside, the sanctuary buzzed with excitement. Every pew was filled, and extra chairs lined the walls, the wooden floors creaking under the weight of so many souls gathered together. Samuel sat with his sons in the front row as the service began. One by one, members of the congregation stood to share stories, how Samuel had counseled them through grief, celebrated their joys, and shown up at hospitals in the middle of the night, never asking anything in return. Mrs. Johnson, who'd been there since Samuel's first sermon, spoke about how he'd helped her through her husband's passing, her voice quavering with emotion. "Pastor Hayes never asked for anything in return," she said, dabbing at her eyes. "He just gave and gave, like Jesus taught us to." Mr. Thompson recalled how Samuel had spent countless hours mentoring troubled youth, including his own son, who now sat proudly with his own family. "He treated them all like they were his own," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Changed lives without even knowing it." Samuel listened with his head bowed, humbled by their words, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. His son sat beside him, proud but restless. Marcus kept fidgeting with his tie, while the others exchanged meaningful looks, their shoulders tense with anticipation. When it was time for his final sermon, Samuel rose slowly and made his way to the familiar pulpit. The wood was smooth beneath his fingers, worn from years of use, each groove a testament to countless messages delivered. He looked out at the sea of faces. Some he'd baptized, some he'd married, some he'd helped bury loved ones, all part of his extended family. "I have spent my life giving," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion in his heart. "But today, I stand before you as a man grateful to have received so much more than I could ever return." The congregation burst into applause, many rising to their feet, handkerchiefs dotting the crowd. But Samuel couldn't help noticing how his sons remained seated, their expressions a mix of love and something else, something that made his heart flutter with uncertainty, like a prayer waiting to be answered. The evening air was cooling as the Hayes family piled into their cars after the retirement service. Samuel's bones ached from all the handshakes and hugs, but his heart felt full from the outpouring of love from his congregation. He could still hear the echoes of their well wishes and see the tears in old Mrs. Johnson's eyes as she'd hugged him goodbye one last time. "Dad, this day isn't over yet," Andre announced, practically bouncing with excitement like he used to do on Christmas mornings. "We've got one more surprise for you." Samuel raised an eyebrow, studying his youngest son's face. What kind of surprise? He glanced at Marcus, who was trying to hide a smile behind his usual composed expression. "Just trust us," Marcus said, pulling out a clean handkerchief from his suit pocket. "But first, you need to wear this." "A blindfold?" Samuel chuckled, shaking his head at his son's antics. "I'm too old for these games, boys." "Please, Dad?" Andre's eager voice tugged at Samuel's heart, reminding him of countless times he'd given in to that same pleading tone. "It'll be worth it, I promise." With a resigned sigh, Samuel let Marcus tie the handkerchief around his eyes. Gentle hands guided him into the passenger seat of Marcus's car. The leather seat still had that new car smell, a reminder of how successful his eldest had become. The thought filled him with pride, even as uncertainty fluttered in his stomach. "Y'all aren't taking me skydiving, are you?" Samuel joked, trying to mask his growing unease. His fingers found the smooth leather armrest, gripping it lightly. Devin's laugh boomed from the back seat, filling the car with its familiar warmth. "Not quite that exciting, Pops." The car rumbled to life and Samuel felt them pull away from the church. The familiar turns of their neighborhood soon gave way to roads he couldn't recognize by feel alone. Minutes stretched longer than expected, and Samuel's fingers drummed nervously on his knee, a habit he'd never quite broken. "All right, what are y'all up to?" He forced a laugh, but uncertainty crept into his voice. The car ride seemed to be taking them far from their usual haunts, each turn leading them further into mystery. "Just a little further, Dad," Marcus assured him, but Samuel caught the slight tremor in his son's voice, that tiny tell that had given away Christmas surprises since Marcus was small. The brothers filled the car with chatter and laughter, reminiscing about childhood pranks and church picnics. But underneath their playful banter, Samuel sensed tension, like musicians slightly out of tune with each other. Each laugh seemed a little too loud, each story a little too forced. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the car slowed and turned onto what must have been a gravel road, the tires crunching beneath them. Samuel's heart picked up speed as they came to a stop, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "We're here," Marcus announced, and car doors began opening all around. Samuel heard his son's feet hitting the gravel, then Andre's hand on his arm, warm and reassuring. "Careful now, Dad," Andre said softly, helping him out of the car. The evening breeze carried unfamiliar scents, fresh-cut grass, maybe flowers, and something else he couldn't quite place. Samuel's stomach tightened with anticipation as his sons guided him forward, their hands steady but trembling slightly. What could they possibly have planned that required such secrecy? Samuel's mind raced with possibilities as the gravel crunched beneath his dress shoes. Whatever it was clear his boys had put considerable thought into it, and that both thrilled and terrified him. He could feel the weight of their expectations pressing against him like a physical thing. The evening breeze rustled through the trees as Samuel stood, his heart pounding beneath the blindfold. The gravel crunched beneath his feet, and he could smell fresh-cut grass and newly painted wood. Somewhere nearby, a mockingbird trilled its evening song. "All right, take it off," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion, barely containing his anticipation. Samuel's fingers trembled as he untied the handkerchief. As it fell away, the setting sun's golden rays revealed what stood before him. His legs nearly gave out, and a small gasp escaped his lips. "Lord have mercy," he whispered, gripping Marcus's arm to steady himself, his weathered fingers pressing tight against his son's sleeve. There it was, exactly as he remembered it from 50 years ago. The white clapboard siding gleamed in the fading light. The wraparound porch with its distinctive railings curved gracefully around the corner. The red tin roof that used to sing him to sleep during summer rainstorms caught the last rays of sunlight like burnished copper. Even the placement of the windows was identical to his childhood home, right down to the subtle arch of the frames. Tears welled in his eyes as memories flooded back, each one sharp and clear as crystal. His mother humming gospel hymns in the kitchen while cornbread baked, her apron dusted with flour. His father's strong hands working his whittling knife on the porch steps, wood shavings collecting at his feet like pale autumn leaves. The smell of Sunday dinners wafting through open windows. The sound of evening prayers echoing off the walls, filled with hope and gratitude. Samuel's feet moved forward on their own, drawn to the porch steps like a magnet to steel. His weathered hand touched the wooden railing, smooth and solid under his fingers, the fresh paint still carrying that crisp, clean scent. He traced the intricate pattern his father had carved into each post, perfectly recreated down to the smallest whirl and curve. The front door was the same deep green he remembered, with the brass knocker his mother had been so proud of, polished to a mirror shine. His sons watched in reverent silence as their father moved like a man in a dream, touching each familiar feature of the house with trembling fingers. When he reached the window where his childhood bedroom had been, a small sob escaped his throat and his shoulders shook with emotion. "How?" He managed to whisper but couldn't finish the question, his voice breaking with overwhelming feeling. Marcus stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on his father's shoulder, squeezing softly. "It's yours, Dad. We built it for you," he said, his own voice wavering with emotion. Samuel's mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time in his life, the pastor who always had the right words found himself speechless, overcome by the magnitude of his children's love. His fingers rested on the window frame as the weight of his son's gift pressed against his chest, threatening to overwhelm him completely. This house, this piece of his heart he'd thought was lost forever, stood before him, brought back to life by the love of his children, every detail a testament to their dedication and care. The silence that followed Samuel's words felt like a physical weight, pressing down on each of them with suffocating intensity. The brothers stood frozen in place, their proud smiles fading like morning mist as they watched their father take a step backward, his weathered hands trembling slightly against the fabric of his worn suit jacket. "I can't accept this," Samuel whispered again, his voice barely audible above the evening breeze that rustled through the maple trees lining the property. Devin's face transformed first, joy morphing into confusion, then burning anger. His jaw clenched so tight the muscle twitched visibly beneath his skin. "What do you mean you can't accept it?" The words came out sharp as broken glass, cutting through the heavy air between them. Marcus placed a steadying hand on Devin's shoulder, his fingers gripping firmly, but Devin shrugged it off with a jerk. "We spent 2 years planning this, Dad. 2 years." His voice cracked with emotion, raw and exposed. "We rebuilt every detail down to the front porch swing where Grandpa used to sit. Every single detail." Samuel's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he looked at the house, a perfect replica of his childhood home, built with love and memories. The white paint gleamed like fresh snow in the fading light, the green shutters exactly as he remembered them from his youth. But instead of joy, his face showed only deep, haunting pain that seemed to age him before their eyes. "You raised us from nothing," Devin continued, his voice rising with each word, echoing across the manicured lawn. You gave us everything. Everything. But you won't let us give back to you." His hands balled into fists at his sides, knuckles white with tension. Andre stepped forward, his gentle nature showing in his soft approach, arms slightly raised as if to embrace their father. "Dad, please. We just wanted to." "I know what you wanted," Samuel cut in, his voice gentle but firm as steel. "But I can't. I just can't." Each word seemed to cost him dearly. Marcus moved between his father and brothers, trying to defuse the situation like he had so many times before. "Let's all take a breath," he suggested, though his own disappointment was visible in his tense shoulders and the tight lines around his mouth. Jamal and Eric exchanged worried glances from where they stood, while Andre's eyes filled with tears that spilled silently down his cheeks. The perfect moment they'd imagined. Their father, overwhelmed with joy, finally having back what was taken from him, crumbled before them like a sandcastle in the tide. "This isn't right," Devin protested, his voice thick with emotion and unshed tears. "After everything you've done for us, and this isn't right. It's not fair." Samuel stood there, his eyes fixed on the house as if hypnotized. Every detail brought back memories of loss, of his own father's shame when they'd lost it all those years ago. The weight of those memories seemed to physically push him backward, bending his shoulders beneath their invisible burden. Without another word, he turned away from the house, each movement deliberate but heavy with unspoken pain. His steps were slow but determined as he walked away, leaving his sons standing in stunned silence on the freshly laid pathway. They watched their father's retreating figure, the gift they'd poured their hearts into standing empty behind them, a testament to their love, but also to their shared pain. The last rays of sunlight caught the windows of the house, making them gleam like tears as Samuel took one final look over his shoulder, his face a mask of quiet anguish, before turning away completely into the gathering dusk. The headlights cut through the darkness as the car wound its way back to town, casting eerie patterns on the asphalt ahead. Samuel sat rigid in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the passing shadows outside, his weathered hands folded tightly in his lap. The warmth and joy that had filled the evening earlier had vanished, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed against everyone's chest like a physical weight. Devin's fingers tapped restlessly against his knee, creating a nervous rhythm that only heightened the tension. His jaw clenched and unclenched, like he was physically holding back words that threatened to burst free. The muscles in his neck strained with the effort until finally he couldn't contain himself anymore. "So that's it?" Devin's voice cracked through the silence like thunder, making Andre flinch in the back seat. "We spent years on this, and you're just gonna walk away? After everything?" Samuel's fingers drummed softly on his knee, a gentle counterpoint to his son's agitation, but he didn't turn around. His reflection in the window showed eyes that seemed to be seeing something far beyond the darkness outside, perhaps into memories only he could access. In the back seat, Andre shifted uncomfortably, the leather creaking beneath him. His voice came out small, almost childlike, carrying all the uncertainty of a much younger version of himself. "Don't you like it, Dad? We really thought you would." Samuel let out a long, slow breath that fogged the window slightly, creating a small cloud that quickly faded, but no words followed. The streetlights cast moving shadows across his face in rhythmic intervals, making his expression even harder to read than usual. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white under the strain. Every few seconds, his eyes would flick to the rearview mirror, studying his father's face for any sign of softening. The muscle in his jaw twitched with unspoken words, but he kept his thoughts to himself, focusing instead on the road ahead. Jamal and Eric exchanged worried glances in the darkness, their shared concern evident even in the dim light. Eric's hand moved as if to reach out to their father, hovering momentarily in the space between them, but he pulled it back, letting it fall limply in his lap like a surrender. The tension grew thicker with each passing mile, filling the car's interior like an unwelcome passenger. Every traffic light felt like an eternity, the red glow highlighting the pain and confusion etched on each son's face. The familiar streets of their hometown passed by in a blur of storefronts and streetlights, but nobody seemed to notice them anymore. When the car finally pulled into Samuel's driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet night. Before anyone could speak or move to stop him, Samuel reached for the door handle. In one fluid motion, he stepped out into the night air, taking the weight of his silence with him. The brothers watched, frozen in their seats, as their father's silhouette moved toward the house that suddenly seemed much smaller than before. His steps were steady but heavy, like a man carrying an invisible burden that bent his shoulders slightly forward. The porch light cast his shadow long across the ground, stretching it into something almost unrecognizable. The sound of the house door opening seemed to echo in the quiet night, a hollow reminder of their failed gesture. Then came the final click of the lock, definitive and somehow final, leaving the brothers alone with their confusion and hurt. Samuel's footsteps echoed through the empty house as he paced back and forth across the worn carpet of his living room. His fingers pressed against his temples, trying to ease the throbbing that had settled there. The walls that had always felt like a warm embrace now seemed to close in around him, making each breath feel shorter than the last. Even the familiar family photos that lined the hallway appeared to watch him with questioning eyes. "Lord, give me strength," he whispered, sinking into his old armchair. The leather creaked beneath him, familiar and worn from years of evening prayers and quiet contemplation. But tonight, even this comfort felt hollow, like a betrayal of the peace he'd always found here. With trembling hands, he reached for the family Bible on the side table. The leather binding was smooth from decades of handling, its pages yellow at the edges. He opened it carefully, like he had thousands of times before, and began turning the delicate pages. The scent of old paper and memories wafted up, bringing with it echoes of countless sermons and bedtime stories. His fingers stopped at a well-worn section, one he'd referenced countless times in his sermons. The passage about giving and receiving stared back at him, the words both comforting and accusatory. "It is more blessed to give than to receive," he read aloud, his voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. Each word felt heavy on his tongue, weighted with years of living by this principle. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, marking each heavy moment. When it struck midnight, the deep chimes resonated through the house, but Samuel remained still, lost in thought. The sound reminded him of all the late nights he'd spent in this very spot, seeking guidance for others while rarely asking for it himself. His eyes traced the familiar words again and again. How many times had he preached about accepting God's blessings? How often had he counseled others to receive gifts with grace? Yet here he sat, unable to follow his own teachings. The irony of his situation wasn't lost on him. A pastor who'd spent his life giving, now struggling to accept the greatest gift his sons could offer. The house his boys had built, it was more than wood and nails. It was their love made tangible, their gratitude given form. He could still see the pride in their eyes, the hope in their faces, and he had turned away. The memory of their disappointed expressions cut deeper than any physical pain he'd ever known. "Lord," he whispered, closing his eyes tight against the sting of tears. "Why does this feel so hard?" His voice cracked on the last word, betraying the depth of his inner turmoil. The Bible lay open in his lap, its pages illuminated by the soft glow of his reading lamp. The house creaked and settled around him, its familiar sounds offering no answers to his troubled heart. In the stillness, he could almost hear his father's voice from long ago, speaking of loss and pride and the weight of a family's legacy. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Marcus's rental house, casting long shadows across the kitchen table where the 5 Hayes brothers sat. Steam rose from untouched coffee cups, swirling in the tense air between them. The familiar scent of fresh brewed coffee did nothing to ease the heaviness that settled over them like a blanket. Devin's fist came down hard on the wooden table, making the cups rattle and coffee slosh dangerously close to the rims. "He doesn't want it? What kind of nonsense is that?" His voice cracked with hurt and anger. "We spent years planning this, putting every spare dollar into making it perfect. Every single detail was for him." Marcus ran his hand over his face, exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders and the dark circles under his eyes. "It's not that simple, Devin." His tone was measured, but his fingers drummed against the table betrayed his own frustration. The steady tap-tap-tap spoke of sleepless nights and worried thoughts. Jamal leaned forward, his elbows on the table, eyes focused on some distant point beyond the kitchen window. "This isn't about the house." He spoke softly but with certainty, his words carrying the weight of understanding. "It's about him not knowing how to receive. It's about pride and love and everything in between." Eric nodded slowly, his coffee growing cold before him, the surface now still and dark like a mirror. He spent his whole life giving. He doesn't know what it means to be given something this big. He traced the rim of his cup with his finger, a nervous habit from childhood. "Remember how he wouldn't even let us buy him new shoes when we got our first jobs? How he kept saying his old ones were just fine, even though they were falling apart?" Andre sat quietly at the end of the table, looking smaller than his 28 years, his shoulders hunched forward protectively. "So what do we do?" His voice carried the weight of disappointment, of a child whose carefully planned surprise had gone terribly wrong. His hands fidgeted with a paper napkin, folding and unfolding it repeatedly. "We could make him see reason," Devin insisted, his jaw tight and muscles twitching. "Show him all the work we put into it, the exact measurements from the old photos, the way we matched every detail down to the porch swing. Even the paint color. We must have tried 20 different shades of blue to get it right." "That'll just make him feel worse," Jamal countered, shaking his head firmly. "More pressure, more guilt. You know how Dad gets when he feels cornered." "But we did this for him." Devin's voice rose again, echoing off the kitchen walls and making Andre wince. "Every weekend for 3 years, every extra shift at work, every penny we saved, it was all for Dad. We even copied Mom's garden layout, for heaven's sake." Marcus held up his hand, a gesture so reminiscent of their father that it immediately quieted the room. The simple motion carried decades of memories. "We need to stop pushing him." His words carried the weight of authority that came with being the eldest, tempered with understanding. Devin's chair scraped against the floor as he stood up, hands planted on the table, knuckles white with tension. "So we just let him say no? Let all our work go to waste?" Marcus didn't answer, and the silence hung heavy in the air. The brothers sat in brooding silence, the morning sun continuing its path across the kitchen floor, marking time as they wrestled with their uncertainty. Each was lost in his own thoughts, remembering the countless hours spent planning, building, and hoping. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the quiet, each second a reminder of the distance between their intentions and their father's response. Their coffee grew cold, untouched, much like the gift they'd worked so hard to give, a perfect replica of their childhood home, standing empty and waiting, a testament to their love and their father's inability to accept it. The morning air hung heavy with dew as Samuel's old sedan pulled into the cemetery, its tires crunching softly on the gravel path. He parked beneath a sprawling oak tree, its branches casting dappled shadows across his weathered face. For a moment he sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, gathering the strength he would need for the emotional task ahead. With slow, deliberate movements, he stepped out of the car, tucking his hands into his coat pockets to ward off the morning chill. The familiar path to his father's grave stretched before him, lined with weathered headstones and morning glory vines. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the past was pulling him down. The polished granite headstone stood quietly waiting, just as it had for the past 30 years. Samuel knelt before it, his knees protesting against the damp earth. With gentle, reverent fingers, he brushed away the fallen leaves and dirt that had collected on the stone's surface as if tending to a beloved friend. "I'm sorry, Pa," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the morning breeze. The memories came flooding back, sharp and clear, as if they had happened just yesterday. He could see his father's face when the bank had taken their home, the defeat in those once strong shoulders, the tears his mother had tried in vain to hide behind her apron. Samuel pressed his palm against the cold, rough-edged granite, feeling a tangible connection to the father he had loved and lost. "They want to give me a house," he continued, his voice catching with emotion. "The same house we lost. They built it just like it was." He paused, swallowing hard against the lump in his throat. But Pa, you never got it back. You worked so hard, gave everything you had, but you never. The weight of the past pressed down on him like a physical burden, as he recalled all the missed Sunday dinners, the Christmases that should have been spent around the fireplace, all the moments his father should have had but never did. "How can I accept something you never got to have?" he whispered, the guilt in his voice palpable. "How can I deserve what you couldn't keep?" The morning air stirred around him, rustling through the oak leaves overhead. Samuel remained kneeling, one hand still pressed against his father's headstone, feeling torn between the past and the present, between the guilt he carried and the gratitude he was being offered. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly rose to his feet, his joints stiff from the morning chill. A sudden gust of wind swept through the cemetery, stirring the leaves around his feet and ruffling his gray hair. In that moment, Samuel felt a strange presence, not frightening but familiar and warm, as if his father's spirit was there with him. Looking down at the grave one last time, he whispered, "I don't know what to do." The words hung in the air, unanswered, as another breeze rustled through the oak branches above. Marcus stood alone in his father's modest living room, the afternoon sun casting long shadows through the windows. His footsteps echoed softly on the worn hardwood floors as he walked, hands tucked in his pockets, studying the familiar family photos that lined the walls. Each captured moment told a story: birthdays, graduations, Sunday dinners, memories of a life built on sacrifice and love. His gaze drifted to an old wooden chest tucked away near Samuel's desk. He'd seen it countless times growing up, but never knew what was inside. Something made him pause today. After a moment's hesitation, he knelt down and carefully lifted the heavy lid. The musty scent of aged paper greeted him as he peered inside. Stacks of yellowed documents filled the chest, old utility bills with red, past due stamps, handwritten letters, and faded newspaper clippings. Marcus lifted them carefully, aware that he was handling pieces of his father's private history. Then he saw it, a letter that looked more worn than the others, its edges soft and tattered from being handled many times. The paper had turned yellow with age, the ink faded to a pale brown. It was addressed to First National Bank of Alabama, dated 1964. Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it. The handwriting was neat but urgent, pressing hard into the paper. "Dear Sir, I write to you again regarding our family home. I understand the payments are behind, but I beg you to reconsider the foreclosure. My wife and young son Samuel need this roof over their heads. I can work extra shifts at the mill. Please give us more time. This house has been in our family for generations." Marcus had to stop reading for a moment, his throat tight. He could feel the desperation in every carefully chosen word, the pride of a man trying to save his family's legacy. The letter continued with promises of payment plans, of working longer hours, of selling personal belongings, anything to keep their home. But Marcus knew how the story ended. The bank had taken the house anyway. He shuffled through more papers, finding final notices and eviction documents. Each piece painted a clearer picture of why their gift had struck such a deep nerve with Samuel. This wasn't just about accepting their love. It was about a wound that had never fully healed. Marcus carefully placed the letter down on Samuel's desk, his hands shaking slightly. The weight of understanding pressed heavy on his chest as he whispered, "Dad, this is why, isn't it?" The letter lay there, its faded ink telling a story of loss that had shaped their father in ways they never knew. The afternoon sun caught the dust motes floating in the air, making them dance around the painful piece of family history that Marcus had uncovered. The 5 brothers sat around the kitchen table in their rental house, the overhead light casting a warm glow on their troubled faces. Marcus stood at the head of the table, his fingers resting on a worn, yellowed envelope. "I found something today," he said softly, pulling out the letter. "And I think I understand now why Dad can't accept our gift." The brothers leaned forward as Marcus carefully unfolded the fragile paper. The handwriting was faded but still legible, their grandfather's desperate plea to the bank. As Marcus read the words aloud, the room grew heavy with emotion. Andre's eyes welled up as he listened to his grandfather begging to keep his home, promising to work harder, to find a way to make the payments. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice cracking. All this time we thought we were fixing something, but we were just reopening an old wound. Devon pushed back from the table, running his hands through his hair in frustration. His earlier anger had melted into understanding, but the tension still showed in his shoulders. So what do we do? Just let him walk away from the house? After everything we put into it? We can't force him, Eric said quietly, speaking up for the first time. That house represents more than just a gift to Dad. It's tied to his deepest pain. Jamal nodded slowly, his thoughtful gaze fixed on the letter. No, we don't give up on the house, but we stop pushing. He looked around at his brothers. Dad has to come to it on his own terms, in his own time. Marcus carefully folded the letter back into its envelope. Dad spent his whole life trying to make up for what his father lost. Every sacrifice he made for us, every extra hour he worked, it was all because he didn't want us to feel what he felt as a child. The brothers sat in contemplative silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The ticking of the wall clock seemed louder now, marking the moments as they processed this new understanding of their father's pain. Maybe, Andre suggested softly, we need to show Dad that accepting the house isn't betraying Grandpa's memory, that it's okay to receive something good, even when others couldn't. Devon's expression softened. You're right, but how do we do that without pushing? We wait, Marcus said firmly. We give him space, let him wrestle with it. The next move has to be his. One by one, the brothers nodded in agreement. The tension that had divided them since Samuel's rejection of the house began to dissolve, replaced by a shared understanding and purpose. They might not have the answer yet, but for the first time since the argument, they were united in their approach. The letter lay in the center of the table, a silent reminder of the past that still echoed in their present. But now, instead of frustration and hurt, there was patience and hope in their hearts. Hope that their father would find his way to accepting their gift, not just of a house, but of their love. The bedside clock's red digits glowed 4 a.m., casting a dim light across Samuel's weathered face. He sat on the edge of his bed, hands clasped together, his mind racing with thoughts of the house. Sleep had eluded him all night, replaced by an undeniable pull toward the place he'd walked away from 2 days ago. Lord, he whispered, his voice barely audible in the pre-dawn silence. I don't know what I'm doing. The familiar creaks of his small home seemed to answer him. He stood slowly, his joints protesting the early movement. Without fully deciding to do so, he found himself reaching for his car keys on the dresser. The streets were empty as Samuel's old Buick crawled through the darkness. Streetlights cast pools of yellow light on the wet pavement, still damp from the night's fog. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with tension. Each turn brought him closer to the house, and with each mile his heart beat a little faster. The radio stayed silent. He needed this quiet, needed to hear his own thoughts. When he finally pulled up to the property, the headlights illuminated the front of the house like a spotlight on a stage. Samuel sat in the car for several long moments, engine idling, staring at the structure that held so many memories. Finally, he turned off the ignition. The sudden silence felt heavy, broken only by the soft ticking of his cooling engine. His feet crunched on the gravel as he stepped out, the sound seeming too loud in the pre-dawn stillness. The walk to the porch felt like the longest journey of his life. Each step brought back memories, his mother's singing from the kitchen window, his father's steady hammering as he fixed loose boards, the smell of Sunday dinners wafting through the screen door. At the bottom of the porch steps, Samuel paused. His legs felt weak, unsure. The house loomed before him, both familiar and strange. His sons had rebuilt it exactly as he remembered. Every detail perfect, down to the angle of the roof and the pattern of the wooden railings. His hand trembled as he reached for the porch railing. The wood felt solid under his palm, real and present. Not a dream, not a memory, but something tangible, something his sons had created out of love. He gripped the railing tighter, steadying himself. For the first time since seeing the house, he didn't feel the overwhelming urge to turn away. Instead, he stood there in the growing light of dawn, letting the memories wash over him without fighting them. The sky began to lighten ever so slightly, the first hints of morning touching the horizon. Samuel remained still, his hand on the railing, finally ready to face what stood before him. The morning sun painted streaks of gold across the misty Alabama sky as Marcus steered the car down the familiar road. His brothers sat in contemplative silence, their minds still processing the events of the past few days. The tension that had filled their conversations had mellowed into a quiet uncertainty. As they rounded the bend toward the house, Andre leaned forward between the front seats. "Wait, is that—" Marcus eased his foot off the gas pedal, the car slowing to a crawl. There, on the wide front porch of the house they'd built, sat their father in the old wooden rocking chair. A thin blanket was draped across his lap, his head tilted back in peaceful slumber. "He came," Andre whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Devin's hands trembled slightly as he unbuckled his seatbelt. Without a word, he pushed open the car door and stepped out, his footsteps careful and measured on the gravel driveway. The morning dew had soaked the grass and a light mist still hung in the air, giving the scene an almost dreamlike quality. Eric watched from the back seat, his eyes glistening. I've never seen him look so peaceful. Jamal placed a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder, giving it a squeeze. "Go on," he encouraged softly. "He needs you right now." The remaining brothers emerged from the car one by one, their movements deliberately quiet to avoid disturbing their father's rest. The morning birds sang their dawn chorus as Devin carefully climbed the porch steps, each wooden plank creaking softly beneath his feet. Samuel's chest rose and fell with steady breaths, his weathered face relaxed in sleep. The Bible he always carried lay open in his lap, its pages slightly ruffled by the morning breeze. Devin reached for a spare blanket they'd left on the porch swing and gently draped it over his father's shoulders. His touch was tender, almost reverent, as if handling something precious and fragile. The anger that had burned so hot in him days before had melted away, replaced by a profound understanding. The brothers gathered at the foot of the porch steps, watching their father with a mixture of love and relief. They saw in his peaceful countenance something they hadn't witnessed in years: acceptance. The weight that had bowed his shoulders seemed lighter somehow, as if during his solitary vigil on the porch, he'd finally made peace with receiving their gift of love. The morning light grew stronger, casting long shadows across the porch, as the brothers stood in silent witness to this moment of quiet transformation. For the first time since they'd revealed the house, hope bloomed in their hearts. Not the anxious, desperate hope of before, but something steadier and more certain. The morning sun crept over the horizon, casting long shadows across the newly built house. Its warm rays touched the wooden porch where Samuel Hayes sat in the rocking chair, stirring from his outdoor slumber. The blanket someone had draped over him during the night slipped slightly as he shifted, his joints stiff from sleeping outside. He blinked slowly, taking in the peaceful morning. Dew sparkled on the grass, and birds called softly in the distance. For the first time since seeing the house, his heart wasn't racing. Instead, a calm had settled over him, as gentle as the morning breeze. The sound of gravel crunching under shoes made him turn his head. There stood his sons, all 5 of them, watching him with careful eyes. Marcus stood slightly ahead, his usual authoritative stance softened by concern. Devin, whose anger had burned so hot just days ago, now had tears gathering in the corners of his eyes. Jamal and Eric exchanged knowing glances, while Andre fidgeted with his hands, a habit from childhood that showed up whenever his emotions ran high. No one spoke. The morning was too precious for words, too delicate for explanations or apologies. Samuel's gaze drifted from his sons to the house itself. The windows gleamed in the morning light, and the fresh paint seemed to glow. It was exactly as he remembered from his childhood, down to the last detail. But now, looking at it, he didn't see his father's loss anymore. Instead, he saw his sons' love, their dedication, their hard work, their desire to give back to the man who had given them everything. His weathered hands gripped the arms of the rocking chair as he slowly stood, muscles protesting from the night spent outside. The blanket fell away completely as he straightened his back, feeling every one of his 70 years. Taking hold of the porch railing, he pulled himself fully upright, stretching carefully. The wooden boards creaked beneath his feet as he turned to face his sons fully. Their eyes met his, and in that moment, understanding passed between them. No words were needed. The nod he gave them was slight, just a small dip of his chin, but it carried the weight of acceptance, of love received and returned. They nodded back, 5 heads moving in unison, their faces showing relief, joy, and something deeper, the satisfaction of finally being able to give their father the gift he deserved. The afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting warm patterns on the hardwood floors, as Samuel Hayes walked alone through the hallways of his new home. His weathered hand traced along the walls, feeling the smooth texture of fresh paint beneath his fingertips. Each step was deliberate, measured, as if he were walking through a dream he feared might dissolve. In the kitchen, he paused, his palm resting flat against the counter. The scent of fresh paint and sawdust filled his nostrils, but underneath it was something else, a familiar warmth that reminded him of Sunday dinners from long ago, of his mother's cornbread and his father's deep laugh. His heart quickened as he made his way down the hallway toward the master bedroom. The door creaked softly as he pushed it open, revealing a spacious room bathed in natural light. A neatly made bed sat beneath a large window, its quilted cover reminding him of the ones his mother used to make. But it was what sat on the nightstand that made his breath catch. There, placed carefully on the polished wood, was an old Bible, his father's Bible. The same one from which his father had read every evening, his voice strong and sure even during their hardest times. Samuel's hands trembled slightly as he picked it up. The leather cover was worn smooth from years of handling, its pages yellowed with age. He opened it carefully, and the familiar smell of old paper and memories washed over him. His fingers traced the familiar handwriting in the margins, his father's neat script marking passages of hope and perseverance. Sitting down on the edge of the bed, Samuel closed the Bible and held it against his chest. His eyes closed, and words of gratitude flowed from his heart in a quiet prayer. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for these boys, for this gift, for bringing me home." For several moments, he sat there, letting the peace of acceptance wash over him. The weight of the Bible against his chest felt like an embrace from his father, a blessing from beyond. Finally, Samuel stood, wiping away a tear that had escaped down his cheek. He walked through the house one last time, each step more confident than the last, before stepping out onto the porch where his sons waited expectantly. Looking at their faces, these men who had given him back a piece of his history, Samuel felt his heart swell. His voice was steady and clear as he spoke the words they had been waiting to hear. "This is home." The evening sun painted golden streaks across the new dining room as the Hayes family gathered around the table. The aroma of home-cooked food filled the air, crispy fried chicken, warm cornbread, and collard greens steaming in their bowl. Sweet tea sparkled in mason jars, catching the light just right. Samuel sat at the head of the table, watching his sons settle into their seats. The wooden chairs creaked familiarly under their weight, like they'd always belonged there. Andre immediately reached for the chicken, earning a playful swat from Devin. "Some things never change," Devin laughed, nudging his youngest brother. "Still eating like a vacuum, huh?" Andre grinned, piling his plate high. "Hey, I'm a growing boy." "You haven't been a boy for 20 years, Eric chimed in quietly, a rare smile crossing his face. The laughter that followed felt natural, easy, like the tension of the past few days had melted away. Marcus passed the cornbread around, making sure everyone got their fair share, just like he used to do when they were kids. "Remember when Andre used to hide vegetables in his napkin?" Jamal asked, spooning greens onto his plate. "Thought he was so slick." "Until the dog started following him around everywhere," Marcus added, causing another round of laughter. Samuel watched it all, his heart full. The warm light caught the gray in his son's hair, reminding him how much time had passed. But here they were, still his boys, still bringing life and joy to every room they entered. "It's nice having everyone together," Jamal said softly, looking around the table. His words carried weight, acknowledging the journey it took to get here. Devin reached for seconds, his earlier anger completely forgotten. "Pass the chicken, Eric. Some of us still need to keep our strength up." "For what?" Eric asked, sliding the platter over. "Your daily arguments?" "Someone's got to keep things interesting around here," Devin shot back with a wink. The conversation flowed naturally, stories weaving between bites of food. They talked about their childhood, about Samuel's sermons, about the trouble they used to get into. Each memory seemed to make the house feel more like home. Samuel set his fork down quietly, clasping his hands together as he watched his family. The setting sun cast long shadows across their faces, but their smiles lit up the room brighter than any light could. "This feels like home," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't need to say more. His son's smiles told him they understood. They had given him more than just a house. They had given him back a piece of his heart he thought he'd lost long ago. The brothers exchanged knowing glances, their eyes shining with pride and love. They had done something that truly mattered. They had brought their father home. The night wrapped around the house like a gentle blanket, with only the soft yellow glow of the porch light pushing back the darkness. Samuel's footsteps were quiet on the wooden boards as he stepped outside, letting the screen door close behind him with a gentle squeak. The air held that special kind of coolness that only Alabama nights could bring. Not cold exactly, but refreshing against his skin. He lowered himself into the rocking chair, the wood accepting his weight with a familiar creak. A deep sigh escaped his lips as he settled in, his hands finding their natural place on the smooth armrests. The chair's gentle motion started almost on its own, like it remembered the rhythm his body preferred. Above him, the stars sparkled like scattered diamonds on black velvet, clearer out here away from the town's lights. The crickets played their nighttime symphony in the distance, accompanied by the occasional deep croak of a bullfrog from somewhere in the darkness. Samuel closed his eyes, letting the peaceful sounds wash over him. His mind drifted back to evenings just like this one, decades ago, when he was just a boy. He could almost see his father sitting in the chair next to him, pipe smoke curling up toward the stars, his strong hands resting easy on the armrests. The memory didn't hurt anymore. Instead, it felt like a warm embrace. "You would have loved them, Pa," he whispered to the night air. "Those boys, they're something special." The gentle back-and-forth motion of the chair matched his breathing now. For the first time since seeing the house again, Samuel didn't feel torn between what was and what is. The weight of the past, which had pressed so heavily on his shoulders, seemed to lift with each slow rock of the chair. He thought about his sons sleeping inside: Marcus, Devin, Jamal, Eric, and Andre. Each one had put a piece of themselves into rebuilding this place, into giving him back something he thought was lost forever. But they'd done more than rebuild a house. They'd helped him heal a wound he'd carried for far too long. The night air carried the scent of jasmine from somewhere nearby, sweet and familiar. Samuel breathed it in deeply, feeling more at peace than he had in years. This wasn't just a house anymore. It was home again, filled with new memories layered over the old ones like fresh paint over weathered wood. He rocked slowly, listening to the chair's gentle creaking mix with the nighttime sounds. A small smile tugged at his lips as he closed his eyes, finally feeling like he belonged exactly where he was. "I am home," he whispered to himself, the words carrying all the weight of a prayer. The morning sun painted golden stripes across the wooden floor, streaming through the windows of Samuel's new home. He woke naturally, without an alarm, feeling a lightness in his chest he hadn't experienced in years. The bed felt just right, not too soft, not too firm, as if his sons had known exactly what he needed. Samuel stretched and sat up slowly, breathing in deeply. The house had that fresh morning smell, a mix of dawn air and new beginnings. His bare feet touched the cool hardwood as he made his way to the kitchen, following the familiar path he was already starting to love. The kitchen gleamed in the early light, everything neat and orderly. But something caught his eye, a piece of paper sitting in the center of the round oak table. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized it, even from a distance. The edges were worn, yellowed with age and slightly crumpled from years of storage. With trembling fingers, Samuel picked up the letter. The paper felt delicate, like it might crumble if he wasn't careful. As he unfolded it, his father's handwriting emerged, still clear despite the faded ink. The careful, determined strokes brought back a rush of memories. He could see his father now, sitting at their old kitchen table, shoulders hunched under the weight of responsibility. The scratch of pen against paper, the way his dad had paused between sentences, searching for the right words to convince the bank not to take their home. Samuel remembered watching from the doorway, too young to understand fully but old enough to feel the heaviness in the room. "Dear Sir," the letter began. Samuel's eyes moved over the careful explanations, the desperate promises to make good on payments, the plea for more time. His father's dignity shone through every word, even in begging. The signature at the bottom, James Hayes, looked stronger than the rest, as if his father had gathered every ounce of pride he had left to sign his name. Samuel's hands shook slightly as he lowered himself into a kitchen chair. The morning light caught the tears forming in his eyes, turning them to gold. But these weren't tears of sadness or regret. For the first time, reading these words didn't feel like reopening an old wound. Looking around the kitchen, his kitchen now, Samuel felt something shift inside him. This house, built with such love by his sons, wasn't trying to replace what was lost. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending that old pain never existed. This was something new, something different. He pressed the letter gently against his chest, right over his heart, and smiled softly. The morning sun continued to fill the room, warming his face. In that moment, Samuel understood. This house wasn't just a building. It was a second chance, a new chapter, a gift of love that honored the past while embracing the future. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the porch as Samuel stood at its edge, his weathered hands gripping the railing. The land stretched out before him, acres of green grass swaying in the gentle Alabama breeze. His eyes traced the path where he used to run as a boy, chasing fireflies in the twilight hours. Marcus approached quietly, his footsteps creaking on the wooden boards. He stood beside his father, hands tucked in his pockets, sharing the peaceful moment. The air between them felt lighter than it had in days. "You read it," Marcus said softly, not really a question. Samuel nodded, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "Your grandfather," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "He fought so hard to keep a home for us." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "I always thought that if I took this house, I was betraying him." Marcus remained silent, giving his father space to continue. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the sweet scent of magnolia blossoms. "But I see it now," Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger. "This isn't about taking, it's about carrying on." He turned to face Marcus, his eyes clear and bright. "Your grandfather wanted nothing more than to give his family a home. That's exactly what you boys have done." Marcus shifted closer, his shoulder brushing against his father's. "We wanted to give you something permanent, Dad. Something that shows how much we love you." Samuel's hand trembled slightly as he reached up to wipe a tear from his cheek. "Your grandfather would have loved this place," he whispered. "He would have sat right here on this porch, whittling wood and telling stories." "Tell me about him," Marcus said softly, encouraging his father to share memories he'd kept locked away for so long. "He was a lot like you, actually," Samuel said, a small smile playing at his lips. "Strong, determined, always putting family first." He shook his head slowly. Losing the house broke something in him, but he never stopped trying to give us the best life he could. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Father and son stood together, sharing the weight of the past and the promise of the future. Finally, Samuel straightened his shoulders and placed a firm hand on Marcus's shoulder. His voice was steady and sure as he said, "Let's go inside." The evening sun painted the Alabama sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. its warm light filtering through the windows of the new house. Inside, the Hayes family sat around the kitchen table, coffee cups steaming before them. The aroma of fresh brew mingled with the lingering scents of their earlier dinner. Devin fidgeted with his cup, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something more vulnerable. His shoulders were tense, and his eyes kept darting between his coffee and his father. The other brothers noticed his unease, exchanging quick glances. Finally, Devin cleared his throat. The sound seemed to echo in the comfortable silence that had settled over the room. "Dad, I need to say something." His voice was quieter than usual, missing its characteristic fire. The room fell still. Andre stopped stirring his coffee. Marcus sat up straighter. Jamal and Eric leaned forward slightly, their attention fixed on their brother. Samuel looked at his second oldest son with patient eyes, waiting. Devin swallowed hard, his hands clasped tightly around his coffee cup. "I was angry," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I didn't get it. I thought—" He paused, collecting himself. "I thought you didn't want what we did for you, but I see now that it wasn't that, and I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Samuel's eyes softened as he looked at his son, not the grown man before him, but the fierce, protective boy who had always felt everything so deeply. Without hesitation, he reached across the table and placed his weathered hand over Devin's. "I know, son," Samuel said softly, his voice warm with understanding. "And I love you." Devin's shoulders relaxed visibly at his father's touch. The tension that had been coiled inside him since their argument began to dissolve. Andre wiped at his eyes discreetly, while Eric placed a supportive hand on Devin's shoulder. Marcus watched the scene unfold, a small smile playing at his lips. Jamal nodded slowly, his observant eyes taking in the healing happening before them. The family sat together in the growing dusk, their silhouettes outlined by the last rays of sunlight streaming through the windows. The weight that had hung over them these past days had finally lifted, replaced by something lighter, something whole. They remained there, sharing the moment, their coffee forgotten. In the comfortable silence, the house seemed to embrace them, wrapping them in the warmth of family, forgiveness, and love. The first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon as Samuel Hayes opened his eyes. For the first time in days, his heart felt light, unburdened by the weight he'd carried for so long. He slipped out of bed, his bare feet touching the cool wooden floor, his floor, in his home. Walking to the front door, Samuel paused for a moment, his hand resting on the brass doorknob. He opened it slowly, stepping out onto the porch as the crisp morning air filled his lungs. The dew-covered grass sparkled in the early light, and birds called softly from nearby trees. "Good morning, Lord," he whispered, his voice carrying a newfound peace. Looking around, memories of the past few days washed over him, not with pain anymore, but with understanding. There, on those porch steps, Andre had sat beside him yesterday, sharing stories about his new job. Over there by the old oak tree, Devin had apologized, his usual fire replaced by genuine remorse. And at that kitchen table visible through the window, his family had come together again, stronger than ever. Samuel ran his hand along the porch railing, feeling the smooth wood beneath his fingers. Each board, each nail, each brushstroke of paint represented his son's love for him. They hadn't just built a house, they'd created a bridge between past and future, between giving and receiving. For decades, Samuel had poured himself out for others. Every sermon, every prayer, every late-night counseling session had been about giving what he had to those in need. He'd raised 5 boys on his own, giving them everything he could, never counting the cost. But now, standing on this porch, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, Samuel finally understood. This wasn't the end of his journey. It was simply a new chapter. God wasn't asking him to stop giving. He was teaching him the grace of receiving. The morning breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the sweet scent of magnolia blossoms. Samuel made his way to the rocking chair, the same one where his sons had found him sleeping days ago. He settled into it, feeling its familiar embrace. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, his words carried away by the gentle wind. The rising sun warmed his face as he rocked slowly, at peace with where he was, who he was, and what this home meant. This was more than just a house. It was his son's love made visible, their gratitude given form. And finally, Samuel Hayes was ready to receive it all. The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows of Samuel's new home as the family gathered around the dining table. The spread before them was familiar: fried chicken, cornbread, and all the fixings that had always marked their family meals. But something was different tonight. The air felt lighter, warmer somehow. Andre couldn't stop grinning as he passed the bowl of mashed potatoes to Eric. "Remember when we tried to cook dinner for Dad's birthday that one time?" he asked, chuckling. "Lord, what a disaster." Jamal shook his head, smiling. "Smoke everywhere, and that poor chicken was black as coal." "But Dad ate it anyway," Eric added softly, glancing at Samuel with affection. "Every bite," Samuel confirmed, his eyes twinkling. "Though I did drink about a gallon of water afterward." Devin threw his head back, laughing. "And remember how Marcus tried to convince us it was perfectly seasoned?" "Hey now," Marcus protested, but he was smiling too. "I was trying to save our dignity." The laughter flowed freely, bouncing off the walls of their new home. Samuel watched his sons, really watched them. Marcus's quiet pride, Devin's passionate gestures, Jamal's thoughtful smile, Eric's gentle presence, and Andre's eager energy. His heart swelled with love for these men who had once been his little boys. He cleared his throat and lifted his glass of sweet tea. The movement caught everyone's attention, and the table gradually fell silent. "I have something to say," Samuel began, his voice steady, despite the emotion building in his chest. He looked at each of his sons in turn, seeing the mix of hope and uncertainty in their eyes. "I accept it. I accept all of it." The words hung in the air for a moment. Then Devin's face broke into a wide smile, and Andre's eyes filled with tears. Jamal and Eric exchanged knowing looks, while Marcus sat up straighter, his shoulders relaxing visibly. Marcus lifted his own glass, his voice thick with emotion. "To Dad, to home. To Dad, to home," the others echoed, glasses clinking together in the warm evening light. Samuel looked around at his sons, his family, and felt nothing but joy. The weight of the past, the guilt he'd carried for so long, had finally lifted. In its place was something beautiful: acceptance, love, and the promise of new memories in this house his sons had built with their hearts. The night wrapped around Samuel like a familiar blanket as he eased himself onto the porch. His bones creaked a bit. He wasn't as young as he used to be, but the rocking chair welcomed him like an old friend. The wood beneath him was smooth, crafted with the same care his sons had put into every detail of this house. Crickets chirped their evening song in the distance, a melody that took him back decades. The sound was exactly the same as it had been when he was a boy, sitting on another porch, watching his father in a chair just like this one. Samuel's hands gripped the armrests, feeling their solid presence beneath his fingers. The gentle back-and-forth motion of the rocker soothed him as he tilted his head back, taking in the vast expanse of stars above. The same stars his father had gazed upon, probably wrestling with his own thoughts just as Samuel was now. "You would have loved them, Pa," he whispered to the night sky. "These boys of mine, they're something special." A tear slipped down his weathered cheek, catching him by surprise. But unlike the tears he'd shed at his father's grave, these felt different. They weren't heavy with regret or sorrow. These tears carried something else: relief, gratitude, and most of all, love. More tears followed, and Samuel let them come. He didn't try to wipe them away or hold them back. Each one felt like releasing a weight he'd carried for far too long. The weight of his father's lost home, the weight of feeling unworthy, the weight of believing he couldn't receive love as freely as he gave it. The gentle creaking of the rocking chair kept time with his quiet tears. In the distance, an owl called out, its voice carrying across the peaceful night. Samuel closed his eyes, feeling the cool breeze against his damp cheeks. For the first time in decades, he felt truly at peace, not just with the house, but with himself. A soft chuckle escaped his lips as he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. The sound surprised him, but it felt right. All these years, he'd been holding on to his father's pain, thinking it was his duty. But maybe his father had wanted something different for him all along. Maybe this was exactly what his father would have wanted. His son surrounded by love, in a home built by the hands of his children. Samuel rocked gently, his heart fuller than he could remember it being in years. The night enveloped him in its quiet embrace as the stars continued their silent vigil overhead. The morning sun painted the world in shades of gold, its rays streaming through the windows of Samuel's new home. The sound of zippers closing and drawers shutting echoed through the halls as Marcus, the eldest, carefully packed his suitcase. Samuel watched from the doorway, his heart full but heavy. "You sure you packed everything?" Samuel asked, his voice soft. Marcus looked up, a gentle smile crossing his face. "Yes, Dad. Just like when I was heading to college, remember? You asked me the same thing 3 times that morning, too." Samuel chuckled, remembering that day clearly. Old habits die hard, I suppose. One by one, the other brothers emerged from their rooms, bags in hand. Jamal carried his briefcase, always the professional. Eric had his old duffel bag, the same one he'd used in high school. Andre struggled with an oversized suitcase, while Devin just had a simple backpack slung over his shoulder. They gathered in the living room, the morning light streaming through the windows. Marcus stepped forward first, wrapping his arms around Samuel in a tight embrace. "We'll be back soon, Dad," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. "This is home now." Jamal came next, his usual calm demeanor softened by the moment. He hugged Samuel warmly, pulling back to look him in the eye. "Don't forget to call," he said with a knowing smile, "and actually answer the phone this time." Eric and Andre moved forward together, sandwiching their father in a group hug that nearly knocked him off his feet. "We'll visit more often," Andre promised, his voice muffled against Samuel's shoulder. "Maybe every month?" "Every month?" Samuel laughed. "Your old man might need some peace and quiet sometimes." Devin hung back, shifting his weight from foot to foot, always the tough one, always trying to hide his emotions. But when he finally stepped forward, he pulled Samuel into the tightest hug of all. "I love you, old man," he whispered, his voice rough with unshed tears. Samuel patted his back, feeling the tremor in his son's shoulders. "I love you too, son. All of you." They made their way to the driveway where their cars waited. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh grass and possibility. Each son loaded their bags, closed their trunks, and turned for one final wave. Samuel stood at the edge of the driveway, watching as they climbed into their vehicles. The sun warmed his face as he raised his hand in farewell. One by one, they pulled away, Marcus first, then Jamal, followed by Eric and Andre sharing a car, and finally Devin. As the last car disappeared around the bend, Samuel remained standing there. But something was different now. The emptiness that usually followed their departures was replaced by something warmer, something fuller. He wasn't watching them leave. He was watching them go home to their own lives, knowing they would return to this place they had built together. For the first time, he didn't feel alone. He felt loved, deeply, completely, unconditionally loved. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wooden floors of Samuel's new home. The house felt different now, quieter, but not empty. The memories of the past few days lingered in every corner, warming the space like invisible sunlight. Marcus, the last of his brothers to leave, stood in the living room, his bag packed but still untouched by the door. He moved slowly, as if trying to stretch these final moments. Samuel watched him from his favorite chair, noting how his eldest son's eyes kept scanning the room, checking and double-checking that everything was in order. "The house won't disappear when you leave, son," Samuel said softly, a gentle smile playing on his lips. Marcus chuckled, but his laugh carried a touch of worry. He walked over to where his father sat and knelt beside the chair. His eyes, so much like Samuel's own, searched his father's face. "Are you really happy, Dad?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the weight of years of responsibility. Samuel reached out and placed his weathered hand on his son's shoulder, The touch was firm, reassuring. "For the first time in a long time," he replied, his voice steady and true. Marcus let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for days. His shoulders relaxed, and a genuine smile spread across his face. "Good." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, father and son, the afternoon light warming their faces. Samuel could see the boy Marcus had been in the man before him, the serious child who always carried more than his share of worry, who watched over his brothers with careful eyes. "You don't need to worry about me anymore," Samuel said softly. "I understand now. This house, it's not just about the past. It's about all of you, about the love you put into building it." Marcus nodded, standing up slowly. He walked to his bag, picking it up with careful hands. At the door, he turned back one last time, his eyes bright with emotion. "I love you, Dad," he said, his voice thick. Samuel stood, crossing the room to embrace his son. The hug was tight, speaking volumes that words couldn't express. When they pulled apart, both men's eyes were damp, but their smiles were bright. Marcus walked to his car, placing his bag in the trunk. Samuel stood on the porch, watching as his eldest son slid into the driver's seat. The engine hummed to life, and Marcus gave one final wave before pulling away. Samuel remained on the porch, watching until the car disappeared around the bend. A peaceful smile settled on his face as he turned back to the house, his home. The door closed behind him with a gentle click, the sound of belonging. The evening settled over the house like a warm blanket, wrapping Samuel in a peaceful silence. His footsteps echoed softly against the wooden floors as he walked through the hallways, his weathered hands brushing against the door frames. Each touch brought back memories of the past few days, the laughter, the tears, the healing. At the dining table, he paused. The chair still sat slightly askew, exactly as his sons had left them. He could almost hear Devin's booming laugh, see Andre's shy smile, feel the warmth of their presence. The empty coffee cups still sat in the sink waiting to be washed, but Samuel couldn't bring himself to clean them just yet. Each unwashed dish was a reminder that his boys had been here, that this wasn't just a dream. Moving through the house, Samuel felt different. The silence didn't feel heavy anymore. Instead, it felt like a gentle pause between visits, not an endless emptiness. His sons' voices seemed to echo in every corner, their promises to return ringing true in his heart. In his bedroom, Samuel lowered himself onto the bed, the mattress creaking softly beneath his weight. His eyes found the photo frame on the nightstand. 5 young boys clustered around him, their faces bright with hope and uncertainty. It was taken the day the adoption was finalized, when they officially became a family. He remembered how nervous they all were, how Marcus tried to look brave for his younger brothers, how little Andre couldn't stop fidgeting. Picking up the frame, Samuel traced each face with his finger. His boys, now grown men with lives of their own, but still his boys. The fear that used to grip his heart when they left was gone now. He knew with certainty that they would return, that their love wasn't measured by distance or time. The past few days had changed something fundamental inside him. The weight of his father's lost home no longer pressed down on his shoulders. Instead, he felt the lightness of acceptance, the joy of receiving love freely given. His sons had built more than just a house. They had built a bridge between his past and present, helping him find peace with both. In the quiet of his room, Samuel's heart felt full to bursting. The tears that slipped down his cheeks weren't born from loneliness or regret, but from pure joy. He looked at the photo one more time before setting it back on the nightstand. "Thank you, Lord, for making me their father," he whispered into the stillness, his voice thick with emotion. A tear rolled down his weathered cheek, catching the last rays of evening light streaming through the window. The photo sat on his nightstand, 5 young faces frozen in time, a testament to the love that had built this home. The moonlight spilled through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floors. Samuel moved through the house with slow, deliberate steps, his hand trailing along the wall. The quiet wrapped around him like an old friend. In the living room, he paused to straighten a throw pillow Andre had left askew. The simple action made him smile. How many times had he done this when the boys were young? The house may have been silent, but it spoke to him in 1,000 little ways. He walked to the kitchen where the dishes from his son's last meal still sat drying in the rack. He didn't rush to put them away. Each plate, each cup, was a reminder of their presence, of their laughter around the table. Making his way to the front door, Samuel placed his hand on the wooden frame. The grain felt smooth beneath his fingers, worn by countless touches. He inhaled deeply, then let out a long, slow breath. His shoulders relaxed, tension he didn't know he was carrying melting away. The emptiness that had once felt so suffocating now brought him peace. Every corner held echoes of his sons: Devin's booming laugh, Marcus's quiet wisdom, Jamal's thoughtful questions, Eric's gentle presence, and Andre's eager smile. They weren't gone, not really. Their love had seeped into these walls, becoming part of the house itself. He walked through each room again, this time seeing beyond the physical space. In the living room, he saw movie nights and story times. The kitchen held Sunday dinners and midnight snacks. Even the hallway carried memories of sock sliding races and whispered conversations. Standing in the middle of his new home, Samuel felt something settle in his heart. This house wasn't empty at all. It was overflowing with love, with memories both old and new. Each room held promises of future visits, of grandchildren's laughter, of more family dinners to come. He reached for the last light switch, his hand steady and sure. As darkness fell, a smile spread across his face. This house was built on love. He whispered into the quiet. The words felt right, true in a way that reached deep into his soul. Without hesitation or fear, Samuel walked to his bedroom, leaving the silence behind him like an old worry finally laid to rest. The wooden porch creaked softly under Samuel's feet as he stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness. The air was crisp, carrying the last whispers of night, and dew sparkled on the grass like scattered diamonds. He settled into his rocking chair, its familiar groan a comfort in the quiet morning. His hands, weathered from years of service, rested easily on the armrests. The sky above was slowly shifting from deep blue to lighter shades, stars fading one by one. Samuel breathed deeply, taking in the earthy scent of morning. The gentle back-and-forth motion of the rocking chair brought memories of his father, of countless mornings spent watching the sun rise together. But for the first time, these memories didn't bring pain. Instead, they wrapped around him like a warm blanket, comforting rather than constraining. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, they painted the world in shades of gold and pink. The light touched everything: the fresh paint on the house, the carefully tended flower beds his sons had planted, the old oak tree standing sentinel in the yard. Samuel watched as his new home emerged from the shadows, piece by piece, into the growing day. His heart swelled with a feeling he couldn't quite name, something between gratitude and joy, peace and contentment. This house, built by his sons' hands and hearts, wasn't just wood and nails. It was every late-night conversation they'd had while planning it. It was every argument over paint colors and floor plans. It was every "I love you" they couldn't quite say out loud, so they'd said it with hammer and saw instead. The morning light grew stronger, warming his face. Samuel closed his eyes, feeling the heat on his skin. He wasn't trapped anymore, not by the past, not by guilt, not by fear. The weight he'd carried for so long had lifted, replaced by something lighter, brighter. This was more than a house. It was a testament to love, to 5 boys who grew into men who never forgot what their father had given them. It was proof that sometimes the greatest gift isn't in the giving, but in learning to receive with an open heart. The chair rocked steadily, a rhythm as natural as breathing. A small, peaceful smile tugged at Samuel's lips as he sat there, bathed in the morning light, finally, completely at home. The evening sun painted the landscape in shades of amber and gold, its warm light filtering through the trees surrounding Samuel's new home. He stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the wooden frame, taking in every detail of the house his sons had built with such love. The breeze carried the sweet scent of honeysuckle, reminding him of summers long ago when he'd watch his father tend to their garden. But this time, the memory didn't bring pain. only a gentle warmth in his chest. Samuel stepped onto the porch, his footsteps echoing softly against the wooden boards. His weathered hands found the porch railing, fingers tracing the smooth grain just as his father's had done countless times before. The wood felt familiar beneath his touch, like greeting an old friend. "This is home," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the evening chorus of crickets. The words felt right in his mouth, true in a way they hadn't been before. This wasn't just a house anymore. It was the physical embodiment of his son's love, a bridge between past and present. Turning back toward the door, Samuel paused for a moment, watching the last rays of sunlight dance across the porch boards. He thought of his boys, Marcus's quiet strength, Devon's fierce loyalty, Jamal's gentle wisdom, Eric's thoughtful nature, and Andre's boundless heart. Each of them had poured a piece of themselves into this place. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click. The house embraced him, warm and welcoming. Family photos lined the walls, capturing moments of joy and growth. Samuel's eyes lingered on each one, his heart full with the knowledge that new memories would soon join them. The living room felt different now, no longer a reminder of what was lost, but a promise of what was to come. His sons would return, filling these rooms with laughter and life again. And in between their visits, the house would hold their love, keeping it safe until they came back home. Samuel made his way to the front porch again, settling into his rocking chair with a contented sigh. Above him, the first stars began to peek through the darkening sky, twinkling like distant diamonds. The gentle motion of the chair soothed him, and for the first time in more years than he could count, Samuel felt the weight of the past truly lift from his shoulders. As night settled in around him, Samuel Hayes finally allowed himself to rest, truly rest, knowing he was exactly where he was meant to be. The stars continued their silent vigil overhead as his eyes closed, a peaceful smile playing at the corners of his mouth. If you enjoyed the story of Samuel, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.